Hi everyone, today I want to talk about Maniac, a new Netflix series starring Emma Stone and Jonah Hill. This video will serve both as a review then as an explanation of all the weird stuff that we see going on in Maniac, so obviously, spoiler alert. Maniac sets up the loneliness of its characters through a dystopian alternative New York City where one can rent fake friend proxies, to tell you everything that you ever wanted to hear, or by becoming a pretend husband to newly widowers. Owen post-trauma with girlfriend Olivia, which he mistakes for another fake proxy bought by his parents and that obviously escalates his blip, begs the question, when everything can be artificially produced, even connections, what do you know what's real and what's not? Everything in this world seems geared towards escaping reality, whether that's by simulating intimacy or offering an actual route out of this world and to the moon. Even the apartment in which Owen lives, which by the way is reminiscent of Sam Lowry's apartment in the 1985 film Brazil, works both as a sterile container and a metaphorical claustrophobic jail that reminds the character of its own anonymity, which is quite ironic considering that he also pays 85% of his salary towards maintaining said home. So Maniac further presents the lack of connection between its people with subtle nods to the over-reliance of capitalism, with the system of ad buddy, huge adverts that are literally next to your bed window, and multinational drug companies that use needy people as guinea pigs on a daily basis. The series has a VHS monochrome aesthetic coupled with advanced technology that still looks like something out of the 80s. This New York has a statue of extra liberty and cleaning robots. This familiarity, if that's even a word, makes us confused about its timeline. I've seen a lot of people placing Maniac in a futuristic time, but from the show we know that Dr. Monterey's date of birth is 1977, which sets Maniac in present day. The world we see in Maniac is temporarily the same of our own, but logistically not quite the same as ours. It's simply our world if it had developed in a different way. Owen is the introverted and schizophrenic son of a wealthy family where everyone but him seems to be extremely successful. Owen's surname, Milgram, can be a reference to the Milgram experiment, the notorious social psychology research aimed at measuring the obedience to authority figures in contrast to the participants' individual conscience. It definitely seemed particularly relevant to Owen, a man under the constriction of the authority figure of his father that finds it impossible to express his individuality against his family, except through sudden outbursts and hallucinations of his psychosis.
I have to go. Goodbye.
Wait, you're not playing Boulder Dash?
No, I can't. Bye.
Oh, Owen, come on. You love Boulder Dash.
No, I don't fucking love Boulder Dash. Boulder Dash is bullshit.
The pressure that Owen feels is only intensified when he's emotionally forced to become the alibi for his brother's sexual harassment suit. Because of his mental instability, he has difficulties in distinguishing reality from fiction, frequently hallucinating a Jed lookalike that tells him about his heroic role in a pattern of the universe.
Owen, do you know what is real?
$100%.
At a pharmaceutical trial, he meets streetwise drug-addicted Annie, who supposedly is Handler, the one who has to wake him up in order for him to complete his mission. The trial is for a new drug that aims at eradicating all human pain and suffering, and that it is actually based on the neuromatrix theory proposed by Melzack in 1990. Basically, the neuromatrix theory of pain doesn't believe that mental pain follows the same pattern that physical injuries do, but derives from a series of active and subjective experiences through a series of neurons. In order to address and modify this neuromatrix, the trial is divided in 3 stages. The first, pill A, agonia, which is Greek for a state of agony, is about identifying the core trauma of the subject's lives and therefore making it relieve it. The second, pill B for behavioral, aims at uncovering the deep-seated self-defense mechanisms which the brain creates in order for humans to keep their suffering hidden. This seems to be the more critical point from the trial perspective, as the test the potential subjects carry through in the first episode is aimed at understanding whether these people can respond positively to lower the barriers. It isn't a coincidence that Annie doesn't pass the test. The doctors need to take into consideration the psychological barriers that may prevent potential subjects of going past their traumas. Annie's red light is translated later in the confrontation stage, the most relevant stage instead from the subject's perspective, as it represents the often elusive step of accepting and dealing with one's own issues. And we see how Annie is unwilling of letting go of her sister's death and therefore avoiding to face the resolution which the trial is supposed to achieve. As such, Annie represents a disruptive influence on the whole trial, but it is also Annie which in the end helps Owen in dealing with his personal issues.
But I am real. You know me. You're braver than this, Owen. And I will never do that to you.
Yet another paradox which Maniac introduces to communicate that human vulnerability can only be lessened through connections. Through each of these stages, we fall deeper in Owen and Annie's minds, traumas and fantasies, arriving at a point in which we are completely immersed in a dream state world, like the characters are. This is when the series seems to forget about its capacity for subtle. When Owen and Annie are trying to arrive to their metaphorical exit and they literally have to spell out for the audience that they are slaying their demons. So, in episode 4, we see Owen and Annie's alter egos, Bruce and Linda, married with kids in the 80s, in an odd quest about saving a lemur which was placed in Linda's care by a lovely elderly which she took care of. Lemur aside, here we start seeing how Owen and Annie's brains start constructing alternative realities, taking cues from what they actually seen in real life. For example, the fish and wildlife agent that ends up in a gunfight with the gangsters and the previously interrogated Linda in the care home is the same New York agent that speaks to Annie outside Milgram Industries back in episode 1.
Are you a cop?
Sort of. I mean, there's not much of a difference, authority-wise.
Are you a cop?
Not much of a difference, authority-wise.
Owen's alter ego in the final Dream World iteration is Snorri Agnerson, name which we seen on an ad for an Icelandic fish, also back in episode 1. More importantly though, we see how these dreams are representative of Owen and Annie's real past traumas. When for Annie, Linda goes to Nan's daughter to deliver the lemur, she sees the word Nasland on the door. Nasland is the surname of the man that crashed Annie's car, leading to her sister's death. That's why the concept of the conversation between Linda and the daughter is about the fact that some people shouldn't have children, followed by the revelation that Nan's daughter is indeed already pregnant with a boy, which she's going to name Greg Fuck You Nan, which spells F-U-N, the middle name of the man which Annie sees responsible for her sister's death.
My sister and I were in a car crash 5 years ago. The driver passed out behind the wheel of a semi-truck. He had been driving for 30 hours. He was high on no-dose. His name was Greg F.U.N. Nasland.
Likewise, Bruce's main significance in this episode is about his perceived inability to make his wife happy, derived from Owen's own fear of fucking up every possible relationship he will ever have because of the past trauma with Olivia.
Sorry. I can't make you happy.
Similarly, in episode 5, Annie becomes Early Kane, a con artist, the metaphorical representation of her own mother, a skilled manipulator, representing the fear that Annie has about becoming like her. In episode 7, Owen faces his own guilt about lying for his family, and Annie is literally placed in front of a mirror to face her guilt about her sister's death, hereby starting a confrontation process. In episode 8, Owen faces his own shame and embarrassment about his mental breakdown when Faux Olivia talks about his crazy ex-boyfriend and learns to leave behind his own idealized version of a normal future with Olivia, understanding that that was not going to make him happy. In episode 9, Owen's essence is described through the Icelandic phrase of utangata.
Every relationship I have had, old or new, has somehow been false. And I've always felt invisible.
The idea that fantasies or made-up worlds can be as important, if not more important, than our reality is discovered by Owen and Annie when they find themselves and their connection through them. The dream state induced by the drugs take them into gangster feuds, fantasy worlds with elves and witches, because in the end the underlying narrative is the same. Owen and Annie's brains dress up their weaknesses in different and unusual clothes, but their intrinsic meaning can still be understood. Therefore, Maniac is fundamentally a series about dealing with traumas and personal issues in order to move forward with one's own life. Because of this, Maniac makes a point of making everyone a subject. Dr. Mantleray has clear mommy issues, and Dr. Fujira, for example, suffer from agoraphobia. Throughout the episodes, each one of them is incidentally subjected to a therapy session, and therefore is portrayed as equally problematic as the subjects they're supposed to help. So, through its surrealistic nature, everything in Maniac remains deeply ingrained in humanity. Even the computer is humanized, moving from being described as GRTA to Gertie, a pseudo-revisitation of the Doctor's mother, acquiring human emotions and feelings.
I think our computer is horribly depressed.
And since Maniac makes a point of making us see how humans are fucked up, it only makes sense for computer Gertie as well to be enabled to deal with such sorrow and grief, and becoming a petty, angry version of itself.
I have a deal for you, Annie, if you're interested. What if I said you never had to return to your drab, gray life? All that obsession with knowing who you are, knowing yourself. True bliss is not knowing who you are.
Maniac finds its awfulness in the final episodes, though, with computer Gertie finding empathy through her grief rather than trying to keep collecting McMurphys, people that never wake up from the dream state. The choice of this naming McMurphys is perhaps another reference to Randall McMurphy, the central character in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which ends up lobotomized and catatonic. At the end, Owen gets his getaway, leaving everything behind and starting anew in Salt Lake City with Annie, as he previously always wanted to do so.
We just do that. We get a house in the middle of nowhere. Start again.
However, the ending scene of them happy in the car, it did remind me a lot of the ending scene of The Graduate, where Ben and Elaine, initially liberated from the constrictions and free to live their love, are suddenly daunted by a feeling of uncertainty for the future. After all, fantasies can help us understand our hidden truths and desires, but at the end of the day, we still need to live in the real world. The next and final scene, in which two animals make their way into the frame, I think are a fantastical representation of Owen's and Annie's current freedom. We see a Chihuahua similar to the lost dog Groucho and the hawk, which are obvious representations of the long lost and finally found identities of Owen and Annie.